Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbite. Eric LaMontagne is with me, who's co-host and co-producer. Eric, welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to see you tonight. And our special guest tonight is Jason Gibbs, who's the Chief of Staff for Governor Phil Scott. Jason, welcome.
Thanks for
having
me.
First time. How nice of you.
It's good to be here.
That's good. Yeah, I haven't seen you in a while. So we're going to be talking about what's the scene on the 5th floor, which is the code word for where the governor and all his staff reside. We call it the 5th floor. So, Eric, you want to start us
Are
off?
there? I feel like I should know this. Are there actually 5 floors in the State House? There are, right?
Floor.
In the Pavilion office building,
Yeah.
So you have the State House, which is the center of the campus. On the left, you have 133,
133.
So there's ADS, the tax department, a few other things there. On the right, again, as you're facing the State House, there's the Supreme Court building.
Right.
And then between
Library.
I always thought it was amusing that the Supreme Court is between the executive offices and the legislature, which kind of makes some sense, right?
Symbolic.
And in the Pavilion office building, which is the old Pavilion Hotel from way back,
right.
there are 5 floors, and the governor's executive offices our working offices are on the 5th floor of the Pavilion. The State House, fun fact, is not really just the legislatures. It is a building that was built and intended to house all 3 branches of government. So if you can imagine a time in which all 3 of our state government's branches all resided in the State House, that was, at the time that it was constructed, the purpose of the State House. So the Legislative Lounge, which is downstairs on the 1st floor, just off of the section where the Lieutenant Governors and the President Pro Tem's offices are, was the Supreme Court chambers.
Really?
I never heard this.
And on the 2nd floor, of course, you have the governor's office and the Secretary of Civil and Military Affairs, which is the governor's principal assistant constitutionally.
Yeah.
Those offices are also in the State House. So, though the legislature, with good reason, thinks of the State House as being its building, it's technically and constitutionally the sort of the space of all 3 branches.
Now, we videotaped David Schutz who's the curator of the State House. He took us on a tour, and he never mentioned that. I'll have to
It's a very sensitive subject with the legislature.
Oh, really? All right, well,
right?
never mind.
Because
I don't want to get David
the Supreme Court now has its own building. The executive now has not just the pavilion, but the whole sprawling apparatus, which is about 8,500 employees and $6 billion of an enterprise. And then the legislature says, well, so we're going to get the State House.
Yeah, I never knew that. And right across from right where the sidewalks go down, that building right there is 120 State Street. And I used to have my DMV office there, and I was right in the front window above the door, and it was a straight shot to the State House. And at Christmas time and the all that they do to decorate. Oh my God, I used to work late at night and it was dark, and there's our State House with the light on the dome, and I always said, oh, that's why I'm here, I remember.
So this is really cheesy. There are definitely mornings and nights where instead of taking the bypass around State Street to get to and from our parking lots, I'll intentionally drive by the State House. I think in every major statewide election that I've been involved in, I have the Sunday night prior to the Tuesday election, I have gone and sat on the wall out across the street from the State House, out in front of the DMV building, and just looked at it, and just sort of thought about what it is that we were trying to do, and what it could mean to the state.
Very nice.
It is kind of cheesy. I don't admit that to a lot of people. It's pretty counter to my public persona, but those are all really true things. Yeah. At the Sunday before, it doesn't matter what time it is. I can be coming from someplace way up north or someplace way down south, and the Sunday night, rain or shine, I go sit on that wall, and I'll sit there for 30, 40 minutes, sometimes an hour, and just think. And it's just this visual perspective of the work of state government. Right. And for me, and I'm kind of a government geek, to think about the intersection of the campaigns which occur outside of Montpelier.
Right.
It's really all about what the direction is that the people of Vermont want to set, what priorities they want to endorse. what their hopes are for the state, all these sort of things. To take all that work over many months, and to think, okay, now it has to be converted into governance,
right.
is part art, part political science, a lot of really dumb luck in terms of the policymaking process and the politics of it all. So I don't know. It's just something.
That's great. Good for you. I'm glad you said that, because I know at motor vehicles, I made it part of the orientation for any new employee, whether they were in state government and coming to go. I would take them on a tour of the State House myself. Yeah. How many employees have never walked up those stairs to go see their State House?
I think the vast majority of them probably, and if they have, it's probably when they were school kids.
Well, maybe.
Again, this is cheesy and I'm probably saying too much, but I have been known to say to members of our staff, hey, just come with me for a minute. In the middle of the legislative session, it could be, when we had, when the governor had vetoed multiple state budgets and
right.
we were in a brawl about whether or not we were going to raise property taxes in a time of growing surpluses and all these sort of things. Like, it was a pretty tense time. And it's easy to lose, it's easy to get jaded, to lose perspective, to be more about the fight than the finish. And so I'm known to, in moments like that, to be like, hey, team, let's go sit in the balcony of the House chamber or the Senate chamber. And to go there at like 7 in the morning on a weekday when everything's lit up and the place is empty and silent, and you just look at it and think about the role of the legislature. I'm sure that there are many members of the legislature, maybe not many, maybe some, could be many, who think we don't really value the work of the legislature as much as we should, because we have differences of opinion on policy or implementation or what have you, or people tend to focus on the politics more than the policy because frankly the politics is easier to understand. It's you're either for this or you're against it, or you're on this team or you're on that team. It's a much shallower, more superficial understanding of things. They would be wrong in that assumption. We really, and this is in part because of the leadership the governor provides, and because he's a creature of the legislature.
Sure, for sure. What, 10, 11, 12 years or so?
Yeah, and 10 years in the Senate, 6 years as the lieutenant governor.
16.
Deep respect for the process, and a deep understanding of the process. I think that understanding has come through in the successes that we've had in the first 2.5 years of the administration. But so, once in a while, when
you better be careful, you may not be able to go and work on Monday. Who is that guy?
When even our own internal team is like, we're locked horns with the legislature. It's good to those 7 a.m. meetings, hey, let's just go sit in the balcony and just think about the role of the House and the role of the Senate and the role of the legislature and all of this, and let's just think about how many humans are involved in this process.
Make this work, right?
And how amazing it is that there is a product. Not everybody agrees with the product. Sometimes the product doesn't go far enough. Sometimes the product goes too far, but there's always a product.
Right.
And it's really take a step back from what feels really personal, and you think about the bigger picture, and it helps to put the work that you're doing in perspective. Sure. And as tough as we can be, and we can be tough. It's never personal, never, and it's always about doing the work.
Good job. So, nice. It was always in my blood anyway. All right, go ahead.
That was great. That was fantastic. It's awesome when interviews kind of run themselves.
Yeah,
that's what you want.
We'll give him the hour. Give him the topic, and he'll talk. So there you go.
I know. I'll go get a seltzer from the fridge. No, it's great because clearly it sounds like you have a really good appreciation for that process, and you mentioned not taking things personally, and I'm sure you have a pretty lengthy work history with dealing with some of fairly conflicting, emotionally charged projects. The Big Dig, for example. Yeah. That was not just everybody, oh yeah, go ahead, let's do this. I'm sure that had a lot of controversy. So the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about your background, what led you to the position that you're in today.
Well, I was born in Rutland and grew up in Brandon. Went to school there my whole life.
So you were born in Rutland.
Yeah.
You weren't just okay.
Yep.
Because that's how you're a real Vermonter, right? Is you have to actually be physically born. I'm told all the time I'm not a real Vermonter because I was born in Lebanon and then
too bad for you.
then 2 days later shipped over the river. But
Yeah, no,
sorry.
my very best friend. We've been friends since kindergarten, very literally. Had the great misfortune of being born at Dartmouth, and so it's a running joke between us. It's a sentiment that can be taken too far, and at this point in our state's history, we really need to be very welcoming to everyone who wants to help us strengthen our state. But it is kind of fun to joke about, whether or not you're a real Vermonter.
well, maybe that's something we can talk about a little later because that is a good point. This whole concept of what is a real Vermonter, and that it's not just as kind of a jovial, casual question as a lot of people might think.
It
on
can
the
be
surface.
weaponized.
Right.
It can be weaponized, and it can turn into something really
let's
negative.
make sure we talk about that a little later on. But yeah, sorry for the tangent. Back to you.
All right, so I was born in Rutland. I grew up in Brandon. Went to Neshabie Elementary School and Otter Valley Union High School. Left for college. Did a variety of things in the private sector. Ended up hooking up with Bechtel Construction, which is one of the largest. Bechtel is one of the largest construction companies in the world. They've done some extraordinary things. At the time that I started working for them, they were up to their elbows in the Big Dig in Boston, the Central Artery Tunnel project, which took all of I-93 and all of I-90 through the city of Boston. So it's kind of this X. I-90 goes east-west from the airport out to western Mass, and 93 goes north-south. There's 171 lane miles of interstate put underground.
We still remember all the details.
I got it all down. Mine like a steel trap.
Probably still has nightmares about it.
Right, I'm sure.
And it was a really challenging project, but it was also a really fascinating project. It was at the time the country's largest public works project. Kind of made building the Hoover Dam look like repaving your driveway. We had 5,000, a little over 5,000 full-time construction employees per shift, 3 shifts, 6 days a week. So there's just a huge amount of activity. When I was there, we were punch listing, so we were completing about $4.5 million of infrastructure a day to put this project in perspective. It is a large part of what has been a real renaissance in Boston, which is a very different place today than it was 20 years ago when we were working on that project. So over time, in a company like Bechtel, they like to develop their younger talent, and they were kind of encouraging me to make some choices about whether or not I was going to stay in a development program. Now I know why the Anson Tebbets.
Yeah, I know. Sorry about that.
Hi, Anson, if you're watching. They were really like, hey, what do you want to do? You can stay in Boston. You can go to projects in England, India, elsewhere. And at the time, I was also setting up to get engaged to Amy, my wife. So proposed to her. Thankfully, she said yes. And we had to decide when we were going to go back to Vermont. And it was either make a big commitment to both of our careers, hers in finance, mine with Bechtel. Or make the move back to Vermont. And shortly after we were engaged, probably about a year after we were engaged, we moved back to Vermont, and I went to work at Fletcher Allen Healthcare, doing public affairs work for them. It was an interesting transition, but a good one. And Amy went to work at Copley Hospital and has been in healthcare here in Vermont ever since. At some point along the way, I got introduced to the treasurer at the time, Jim Douglas, who was running for governor. And I have always been drawn to public service at some level. I was somewhat politically active in college, volunteered a little bit on some Republican campaigns, and thought, what the heck, still young, still energetic. We didn't have any children at the time, so there was this opportunity to take another risk. And so I stepped down from the new job in order to take a full-time gig on Governor Douglas's campaign as his aide-de-camp. So I was there when he got up in the morning, and I was there at the end of the day, and had to get him every place in between and make sure he was rested and prepared and well-fueled, and as a result, built a great relationship with the governor. He won, asked me to stay on the transition, which led to an invitation to stay on the senior staff, and so I worked for Governor Douglas for 8 years, 6 years, a little over 6 years on the senior staff. About 2 years as Commissioner of Forest and Parks, then stepped down to run for Secretary of State. Ran unsuccessfully for Secretary of State in 2010, but got to know the candidate for Lieutenant Governor really well, who was also at the time my state senator from Washington County, Phil Scott. Governor Scott and I, when he was running for Lieutenant Governor in 2010, spent a lot of time together. We drove to a lot of events together. We were, sort of on the same circuit. We collaborated a lot. He won, I did not. We stayed in touch while he was Lieutenant Governor. And in 2014 and 15, I think, when he was starting to think pretty seriously about stepping up to run against Peter Shumlin, we talked a lot about what that would be like, and what the architecture could be, and all the work that needed to be done to make it successful, and then ultimately decided to run and asked me if I would help, and I served as senior advisor on the campaign, and then transition came. He said, "Hey, can you help us run the transition?" And he said, "Hey, will you be the chief of staff?" And here we are 2.5 years later.
That's great.
So that's basically my entire life in a nutshell. I have a beautiful wife and a beautiful daughter, and we have a cat that just got sprayed by a skunk.
Oh, good luck to
So
you
as soon as I
guys.
leave here, I gotta go buy peroxide and baking soda and some Dawn dish detergent, because
That's
it's
what
a
does it.
disaster zone at home right now.
Power
That stuff
to you.
doesn't go away. We had that happen in our house, and it doesn't go away. So talk a little bit about, I don't know how many people would know really what the chief of staff does. I talked a little bit about it, sort of being attached to the hips, but there's a lot. You've got to get the governor's policies
Yeah.
implemented.
And every chief of staff has a little bit of a different portfolio, but
Yeah.
there are some things that are pretty consistent. Number one, we are responsible for making sure the governor has everything that he or she needs to be successful.
Right.
Information, the right people at the right place at the right time. We're responsible for making sure the systems that government relies on are working. We are.
What does that mean? Could you give me an example?
Well, so everything from the signature process on a grant or a land transaction
Oh, I see.
or an appointment
Yeah.
or an extradition, there's the role of the executive in our government is far greater than most people realize. We could be extraditing somebody on any given day. We could be carrying out some major land transactions, sales or acquisitions. We could be verifying information for the purpose of federal grants. We could be signing off on, we could be attesting to the validity of statements that are being made by agencies or departments in order to satisfy our federal partners
Yep.
or other
And
folks.
it's
who
all got to
provide
be
funding.
legally followed.
It's all got to be,
done.
everything,
Yep.
every I's got to be
Yep.
dotted, every T's got to be crossed. So systems and process are really
Okay,
important
sorry.
to the quality of our office. And you got to keep the trains running on time. Then you have to manage the governor's schedule, and you have to make sure that you're making the best use of that schedule, because the most important commodity that you have is the governor and the governor's time. Everybody wants it. There's not enough of it to go around. And you are responsible for the governor's agenda, for advancing the governor's vision. You are also kind of like the assistant principal. You deal with all the disciplinary infractions
Oh,
on
cool.
your team.
Right.
You help to facilitate a lot of the hiring, and deal with departures when that is a necessity. In almost every way, I think the best way to simplify it is the governor is the CEO, the Secretary of Administration is functionally the CFO,
Right.
and the Chief of Staff is the COO.
Yeah, the coup.
And just make sure things get done. I tell people, the shorter version of that answer is I just do what needs to be done.
Right.
And I make sure that everybody else is doing what needs to be done.
So do most of the people on staff report to you?
Yes. So
like the scheduler and the.
Yep. So the everyone has access to the governor.
Yeah.
We have a very sort of flat, nimble organization, but folks report to the governor through me on our office staff. The cabinet, the executive cabinet, of which there are 13 total cabinet members, including me, all report directly to the governor, but routine communication typically flows either through the agency or department liaison, who is a member of my staff,
Right.
and or through me in the case of more significant information. And then when it's appropriate, the cabinet members have the discretion to communicate directly with the governor at their own discretion. So it's pretty dynamic enterprise. As I said, it's 8,500 people. From your experience as a human resource commissioner that if it can go wrong,
It does.
and if humans can do it,
Yeah.
they'll do it.
Right.
So you deal with everything from HR issues to political issues to policy issues to operational issues. We had a hiccup today at the Department of Labor. They had the UI system was down for a few hours, and so we're monitoring that.
Right.
I'm asking all sorts of probably annoying questions just to make sure that they're covering the field and they're looking at everything that needs to be looked at to expedite the restoration of that service, which we got back up. They got back up in a couple hours.
Yeah.
We also the governor's liaison to the Department of Public Safety and Homeland Security and other security
that's important,
issues
too.
are typically run through me
Right.
for awareness. Not always, depends on the circumstance. So it's a really big enterprise. We think about running it like a single enterprise as
right.
opposed to 12 different
Good. I'm proud of you for doing that. I always thought
businesses within
Right.
a bigger portfolio. We've taken a lot of steps. One of the projects that I took on at the governor's request was to build the cabinet into a 13-person executive
Good for
team,
you.
as opposed to the more traditional old government cabinet where everybody's just responsible for their own
Yes,
fiefdom. We meet
exactly.
weekly for at least an hour. Frequently it's longer than that. The level of coordination and communication on an interagency basis is far greater than the last time that I did this. And I think that improves our overall ability.
Yep.
We're getting incredible, we're getting really, incredible is probably hyperbole, but we're getting very positive results at the operational level and some real interesting kind of geeky nuts and bolts things. For example, you've probably heard of lean principles.
Oh. Did I mention who my sister was?
Yes, really high priority for us. Really working to energize the work that the Chief Performance Officer is doing with support directly from the Governor's Office. So this is a priority project in my portfolio. The Cabinet has recognized that it's a high priority. We have over 1,000 frontline state employees trained in lean principles right now.
Good.
In 2 years, we should have about 50% of the workforce trained in lean principles. Lean principles are a methodology of continuous improvement. This
Right.
idea that you
Right.
walk into work every day and you think, how can I make it better?
Right.
And then you have tools that you can use to make it better. And probably most importantly, the people that you're working with don't fear the idea of making things better.
But we've tried this for years, but if the leadership, the governor's office, doesn't support it, and if the last two governors just didn't quite understand it and weren't really interested, and I know that you guys are in it, and it's really working.
It is. It's and it's the kind of thing that we don't talk about it a lot. We don't have press conferences about it. We don't put out press releases. We're just doing the work.
Right.
And this is a governor who came from construction. He's about doing the work.
Right.
And a lot of times the most meaningful things that you can do in government occur outside of the political space, and they're just nuts and bolts, like just the fundamentals. And we talk a lot about focusing on the fundamentals, whether it's on economic development or on healthcare or in government operations. Like really, to borrow a sports metaphor, fundamentals win championships. And so we're just trying to keep it simple, focus on the fundamentals. My personal opinion is that one of the most valuable legacy items of the Scott administration is going to be this focus on continuous improvement, because when we reach 25% or 30% or 40% of the workforce trained in this ethic, it will be very difficult to contain the momentum.
That's great.
And everyone talks about culture change. You don't make culture change by lecturing people from the podium in the House chamber in the State of the State or the inaugural address or what have you. You make cultural change by doing the work and giving frontline employees tools that they can use.
And they know what needs to be fixed. If you just edge them a little bit, they'll fix it. They're great. I love that. I always, when the governor and I would talk, I always said I would hire, if I was the governor, I'd hire people to help me run state government. Oh, and by the way, I'd like you to be in charge of human services. But your primary focus is to help me and the cabinet run state government. Because then they get tied together and can call each other for advice. And I think you've got a good, from what I hear, you've got a good working cabinet.
The dynamic is really very healthy.
Great.
I mean, and as you would know, I mean, I have tried to bring as much knowledge from my first experience to this second. I mean, I never in a million years thought that that a second governor would ask me to do anything. But when one does, you think, okay, well, what have I learned from my previous experience? What mistakes were made? And what things were done well and right that we want to replicate? So I think this is not an exaggeration. Every day, like what can we do that is small p progressive? Like how are we moving the operations of government forward? How are we moving our political agenda forward? How are we moving our policy agenda forward in a progressive way? Because you solve problems. Rome wasn't built in a day. On the Big Dig, we used to say, Rome wasn't built in a day. If it was, we would have hired their contractor. But every restoration, every construction project, whether it's from scratch or whether it's a restoration, is incremental. Like you have a plan and you're working your plan and you're doing the work. And on Monday, the difference between Monday and Tuesday may not be really noticeable to the homeowner, but on Friday they're going to see that the cabinets are all in. And so we kind of take this. Incremental is not a really popular political word because political candidates feel like they got to go out and promise the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they got to be a change agent for big, huge change. But the reality is the way that you make big, huge change is through disciplined, incremental progress. Now you want those increments to be as large as they can responsibly be, but when you start trying to bite off more than you can chew, nothing gets done.
Excellent. Go right ahead. Ask you.
Well, I'm curious. The governor is getting just deluged, I'm sure, night and day with requests for time. Excuse me. With requests for time, people wanting him to learn this thing or know about this or hear this, and the amount of data, just information that everybody must be pouring on him it's got to imagine it's overwhelming. So I'm sure part of your job is to help try to filter out some of the noise from that. How do you do that? I guess, how do you choose what information goes through? How do you handle it if maybe there's some information that goes against something that he's trying to accomplish, but it's still important to know, or if it's maybe not the most positive information? Just walk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah, so you have to have two key ingredients. One, really great people, really talented, intuitive, honest people. The governor has 4 C's in terms of staffing. Character. Do you have integrity? Commitment, are you committed to the work and to the agenda? From my perspective, are you committed to the governor? Competence, can you learn? You don't have to be a subject matter expert, but can you listen and learn and become one? I mean, that's where, just smart people can be successful. And chemistry, because you can have all of the smartest, best people who have top-notch character, but if they don't have chemistry, then it makes being in the trenches very challenging, and it makes going the distance. Think marathon, not sprint metaphor here. It makes going the distance with continuity that you really need to make as much of that incremental progress as possible much harder. So chemistry becomes really important. So good people with great instincts and good systems. And you put those two things, pardon me, you put those two things together, and you've got a way to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff. And the third thing I would add to that is how people communicate with the governor is important. So if you're doing your job right, you are using the phrase, "I don't know, but I will find out," more than any other. You can't have a situation where the people that you're relying on conveying information to the governor, whether it's a cabinet member or a sub-cabinet member or a member of the senior staff, or anyone at any level of the organization that's conveying information to the governor, they can't have a fake it until you make it attitude. They can't be fly by the seat of their pants. It can't be fast chatter, snappy patter. It's got to be like, here's what I know. Here's where I got the information from. Here's my assessment of the information. Here's what everybody else says. Here's what these other sources of information say. Here's my assessment of that information. What would you like to do? And if there's a question that you don't know the answer to, you better say, "I don't know, but I'll find out."
Yeah. Don't try to fake it, right?
And honestly, if you're doing your job right at this level, you're going to use that phrase a lot, because there's so much, to your point, there's just so much information. And there's, for every question that you've prepared to answer, there's probably like 5 or 10 other questions that you're just, you haven't thought of yet.
Because you've hired, like Algo Bay, who is fabulous, and he's just such a good manager. He could probably manage most anything, but he has never worked in state government. That alone is a trick, to have people come in and for the first time at that level, and because the legislature, the day you are sworn in, you just have to know everything, or you're accountable for everything. And they don't give you much of a holiday or a couple of days off just to learn.
Character.
Yep.
Commitment, competence, chemistry.
That's Al.
Somebody like Al is both a good manager and a good leader, and is intuitively a good people person.
Right.
Some people have it, some people don't.
Right.
It doesn't make them better people or worse people. It's just a fact that just that chemistry piece, when you're thinking about the interpersonal chemistry of a team, when you're thinking of it from the point of view of particularly a public enterprise like a government or a publicly facing portion of any enterprise, you have to think about the chemistry being, okay, well, is this person going to be able to develop chemistry with their own leadership team and with their own line staff? What kind of tools do they have in their own personal toolbox to develop the type of relationships that's going to make them an effective leader? Right. And most of the time, we get that right. Small number of times, which you've probably read about recently, those things don't work out. But those are the types of things that we're thinking about in this administration that is not evident to me that we're always so focused in these type of conversations, or focused on in these type of conversations in previous administrations. There's historically, and this is not a critique of any one administration, but historically there's a lot of emphasis placed on, do they have legislative experience? What are the politics of appointing someone to this position? And Governor Scott intentionally took a different approach to building a team, one that's informed by his business experience, one that's informed by his racing experience, which is one area of his life, incidentally, that I have absolutely zero involvement in. It's like,
you don't get to go to Thunder Road.
no, I mean I can go, but it's his space.
Yeah.
Our office doesn't meddle in it.
I'm glad he's back racing.
He's having a great year.
Yeah, he is. He's winning.
So he's down a little bit in the points.
Oh, is he?
I don't really know what it sounds like. I know what I'm talking about. I mean, I basically understand how the point system works there, but what I do know is that he loves it, and it's an important outlet for him. Right. It's also a really important way for him to stay in touch with the people that he serves and where he came from. Right. I mean, I don't know who said this, but somebody said, probably lots of people have said along the way, like, remember where you came from?
Barry boy.
Politics is politics, and policy is hard. It's hard. Doing the work is hard. But remembering where you came from is how you get through it on some days. And I feel like that's part of who he is. Yeah. I also love that his mom is like the world's biggest race fan. Yeah. Moved to Daytona so she could be near the track. And I'm not like, my dad is a big race fan. I enjoy going to the races, but in terms of Thunder Road, that's his space. He's got like his race team, and then he's got his government team, and the two.
I'm sure with
separate.
That job, you got to have some way to just separate yourself, even if it's just for a couple hours.
Yeah, fishing, whatever,
right,
Right.
Like I'm sure if you asked, he'd let you get down there on the pit crew, though.
No, he wouldn't. No, and he knows my character, commitment, competence, chemistry. I think there's at least one box there, the competence box that I can't check.
Yeah. I do want to revisit that, though, or stay on this for just a second. And when things come up that don't necessarily that go against something you're working on, or it's information that is counter to something you're trying to achieve, or it isn't in general somehow not helpful, or even opposite of helpful. It could be even harmful to an agenda item. Do you as like an administration take that as important and try to translate that as in its entirety?
Yeah. So the most important role that we play in terms of information flow to the governor is to make sure that the governor has all the information that is needed to make a decision, and that includes understanding the counterpoints to our own position or his view on an issue. We frequently take up the point of view of the policy proponents with whom we disagree. And we have amazing debates at the staff level that the governor participates in. Sometimes he observes, like me debating with another member of the staff, or two members of the staff having a debate. But the whole idea is to make sure that 100% of the information of the valid information, and if it's credible but unverified, we're probably including that too, with the caveat that this is credible information, but it's unverified. We haven't had the opportunity to research it more deeply or to further analyze it or what have you. But 100% of the information so that he can make a fully informed decision. There are times in our discussions where before we meet with the governor, and you can pick some of the highest profile policy debates and some that you probably never even knew occurred over the course of a legislative session. And there would be times where we would go into a staff meeting, and there's an agenda typically for most of these staff meetings, where I would say to the staff, this is a decision point. This is not, our job right now is to make sure that 100% of the information is on the, and I'm more interested in the strongest argument you can make for the other point of view than for the one that you think the governor should adopt, or the decision that he should make. And again, it speaks to the quality of the team that the governor has built. Our team is very good and very disciplined about knowing when it's a time for, kind of just chatting about something and getting down to business. And so nothing gets scrubbed. We will frequently say, this information came in, we have validated it. It may be inconsistent with our current position on this issue, but it is a valid point of view, or the data behind it is solid, and we can see how they've arrived at this conclusion or have been able to make this argument or what have you. And then there are other times where we say, well, this information is circulating out there, and we can't validate it. We believe it to be false, but this information is out there, or this point of view is out there. I can't say that we get it 100% every time, but I think we do a really good job of making sure that we get as much information. But again, there's always some number of questions in every one of these conversations that we don't have the answer to, and the answer is, I don't know. We'll find out, and that's our job.
Good. And if he does that, I think that's good, because you can't fake it. You have to tell them what is.
Look, this governor is the best listener that I have ever known, and unlike me, he listens way more than he talks. I'm chatty, and I'm just chatty. As Popeye said, I am what I am. But he's a listener, and I think early in his political career, people really underestimated him as a result of being such a good listener.
Right.
But he's taking every bit of it in, every single detail. And at the end, when he's done listening, there'll be either a series of questions or a decision. And then, like a good team, doesn't matter what play the head coach calls, we're going to go out and we're going to run it.
Right. That's right.
And we don't run audibles on our team.
Good.
And that's good team chemistry. It's good team discipline. And you need people who are really intellectually engaged by that environment, because it can be a grind. Because out of the blue, you'll be working a set of issues or problems that you know about, and then out of nowhere, because it's state government, and in Vermont, in a small state like Vermont, we have way more things in our portfolio than a large state like Texas or California would have. So, and here's why. I know this sounds crazy.
I was going to go there for the why.
Okay. So I was talking to a colleague of mine from a very large state, and she said, "Oh, it must be so nice being chief of staff from Vermont." I was like, "It's awesome."
Yeah.
I mean, I love Vermont, and Vermont's the best place on earth, and it's good to be making a contribution and doing what we can to make it better and more stronger economy and all this stuff. And she's like, "Well, you must not have to deal with a lot." And I was like, "Well," I knew what she was getting at.
Yeah.
And I wasn't offended, because they're a big state. And,
Yeah.
they're a big state. And and I said, "Well, what percentage of your communities does the state provide 100% law enforcement coverage for?" She said, "I don't know the answer to that. Our state police really is just our highway patrol, and
Right.
our municipalities all have their own."
Right.
Like, all right, how about transportation maintenance and plowing? Again, we have county government. How about human services? Like, that's a big deal. But we also have county human services.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
like, yeah, we don't have any county government other than our sheriffs, which are really small law enforcement apparati. We cover about 80% of the law enforcement needs of the entire state.
Wow.
We cover.
Is it that high? Wow.
Yeah. We cover almost 80% of the transportation needs of the state. We cover 100% of the human services in partnership with our local designated agencies. And the list goes on and on and on. My point here to her was all of that stuff, all the major crimes, all the roads that need to be paved, all the unsatisfactory plow jobs, or most of the unsatisfactory plow jobs.
Call the governor.
All that stuff. All the human service disasters are all just tragic, sad disasters. They all roll up to the governor's office.
Right.
And she was like, "Wow, I never thought of it." So it's like being a mayor and a governor all
Right.
combined.
Yeah, that county structure does work in other states.
Huge amounts of infrastructure in
Yeah.
other states. Yep.
We have about 13 minutes left, and I wanted to get to the 631 And because I heard him speak of that so often, and it really, how did that even come to be? Because I had this whole thing, that rolled into his 3 priorities, which rolled into the strategic plan, which I'm sure wrote into the finances and the budget. So it's all sort of this cascading thing.
Yeah, if you don't have 3 priorities, you don't have if you don't know what your top 3 priorities are, you don't have priorities, right? This is another I've like now stolen every good phrase. During the transition, so we have 59 days to put all this together.
I know, that's just amazing to me.
Every commitment that he made over the course of the campaign and over his time as lieutenant governor, just to be safe, and put it all into policy and budget.
Right, because that budget has already been worked on by the previous administration.
Well, we took it apart. We took it apart pretty good and proposed some pretty tectonic things. I don't know if you remember the first.
Oh yes, I do.
First few weeks, but we had 3 major reorganizations. We proposed changing the date for voting on school budgets to November.
The 80-20 little.
We
little
proposed
deal.
a whole series of pretty bold change, and so we have 59 days to do all this work. And the governor said, look, the scope of things that we're working on here is just so broad. We really need to stay focused. Like, I'm worried that what has happened to every administration will happen to us if we don't have a North Star.
Right.
Like, if we don't have a focus, so that when we're lost in the policy swamp or lost in the political swamp, we don't have something we can reorient
1,000
to.
points of light. Where did we hear
Or
that
just
before?
1 point of light.
1 point of light.
This is the general direction
Right.
that we're going in.
Right.
And so he was like, go think about this, try to find us something. And so we took all the things that the governor said, and we had the economy, affordability, protect the most vulnerable. And so we spent a solid, this doesn't sound like a lot of time, but in transition time, it's like an eternity, like probably 4 or 5 days trying to figure out what were we going to anchor this entire administration to from a strategic objective perspective. And we ultimately came back to, it's about the size of the workforce as a percent of population. What are the things that are going to be most specific to, or most helpful, most clear in understanding that that's our focus.
Right.
And so it was, size of the workforce, 631. Size of the workforce, we were at the time seeing the size of our workforce decrease by about 6 workers per day.
Right.
There were 3 fewer kids. There are 3 fewer kids in our public K through 12 education system every single day, and we have 0.7, so 1. Babies being born exposed to opiates or other addictive drugs every day. Grow the economy, make Vermont more affordable, protect the vulnerable. So
and I heard from staff that when some proposals were made, they were challenged back with how does it meet these 3 priorities, which was amazing.
We still do that.
I think that's kudos to you guys.
This is marathon, not sprint. This is not, 631 was never intended to be a talking point. It was never intended to be an external tool of any kind. It's strictly for us, we have two 3-digit numbers, 631, which we just explained, and 251.
And what is that?
251 is the number of cities, towns, and villages in Vermont. So 251 Club.
Right.
And this is the idea that our economic growth, and there has been some in Vermont since the Great Recession, has been exclusionary. That our economic policy and our economic growth has been exclusionary. We have 11 of our 14 counties that have not fully recovered from the recession.
Wow.
The ones that have are Franklin, Chittenden, and Addison County. And what do they have? They have proximity to that Burlington metro area, but it's not about Burlington per se. It's about the fundamentals of an economy. It's about infrastructure.
Right.
It's about size of workforce. So they have the academic infrastructure. They have the healthcare infrastructure. They have a broad employment base. They have natural gas. And Addison County now has much more of it. than it did in the past. You know, the fundamentals matter, and so we ask all the time, so 631,
right.
economy affordable to protect the most vulnerable. If you bring a policy forward in this administration, and the entire cabinet and the sub-cabinet and all the policy staff are all now like oriented to this,
right.
you have to be able to defend, you have to be able to demonstrate and defend that policy from the point of view of two of those three strategic priorities of growing the economy, making Vermont more affordable, protect the most vulnerable. Because you can make an argument in any one of those buckets, like, hey, we have to do this to protect the most vulnerable, but it's not going to help make Vermont more affordable, and it's not going to help us grow the economy, and we need to grow the economy in order to protect the most vulnerable.
Right.
So how do you meet two, yet your proposal has to be in two of those three lanes, or it's not a priority for the governor.
Great.
And it makes the policy development process much more focused, and it has made it easier for us to align the legislature's attention in the areas where we all agree we need to focus, particularly in the area of demographics, particularly in the area of increasing the size of the workforce as a percent of population. We could theoretically have the same number of people in Vermont, but what we can't sustain, if we want to keep what we have, if we want to be able to afford what we have in state government and generally economically, we need to backfill every worker that we're losing, because we're relying on them for certain certain level of productivity in the gross state product and a certain level of revenue generation.
Yeah, we definitely applaud. I know Campaign for Vermont has been trying to work really hard on promoting policy and advocating for policy that works to those ends.
Do you think the legislature, I'm looking at the clock, do you think the legislature gets the pension liability issue?
I think so.
I heard it seemed to me they're starting to understand the reality of they better fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Treasurer, to her credit, has been a really important leader in that effort and making sure that the legislature understands what's at stake. I mean, we have, the first two budgets that the governor passed didn't raise a single tax or fee. They grew at about 50% the rate of the previous administration's budgets. I mean, we had, thinking of human services, they closed out the previous fiscal year $70 million below the last full fiscal year of the Shuman administration.
Wow.
I mean, for us to achieve that is nothing short of amazing to me, based on my previous experience in government. These are not things that get a lot of attention in the political space.
I'm sorry that didn't. That's huge.
Because again, it doesn't show up. You know, it's not a tax cut.
Right.
You know, it's not money in somebody's wallet.
Right.
And we fully acknowledge that we need to make Vermont more affordable. That's why we're focused like a laser on the issue of affordability, of measuring, to your point. If you can't measure it, you're not managing it. To measure percent of household income spent on taxes and fees, health care, and housing, including utility bills. And to bring this kind of discipline to the legislature, or to our conversations with the legislature, so they know that the way that the governor is evaluating all these proposals. And so we have 2 consecutive years of very large surpluses. To the legislature's credit, they have designated a large portion to paying off those unfunded liabilities.
Yeah.
Having said all that, we still have to have the difficult conversation about structural change.
Right.
We're willing to have that conversation. The governor's willing to have that conversation. But the reality is we need Democrats in the legislature to step up and say, look, we can backfill, but still the size of that unfunded liability is going to consume the limited revenue growth that we need to pay for what we have. So if we want to get serious about making more investments in priority areas, or even adding new services to government, which I'm not proposing, but in terms of meeting our Democratic friends where they are, we've got to get serious about reducing the drain that those unfunded liabilities represent on revenue growth.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Because
there's
no revenue, there won't be any revenue to spend on stuff.
Right.
And that's going to require structural conversation. We're not going to fight with them about it. There's no point in that. They know how the governor feels. And the political reality is, until there's Democratic leadership willing to have the difficult conversation, we're not going to get we're not going to get the work done, and we're about getting the work done.
Well, we have run out of time. See, there are so many. You could stay here for a day and you'd
Sorry.
keep talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning
Jason.
in.
Hey, thank you.
We didn't get to any of the bills and the issues, but maybe they'll
Next
save
time.
that for another day. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the soundbite.